This is the Listening Project podcast, sharing our stories to amplify our voices, a project of the RPA. We are Richmond organizers who have listened to residents who are the most harmed by some of the biggest polluters in our rich city. These are our stories.
Chevron pollutes Richmond's air with flaring, our water with spills resulting in health issues, clinic and hospital bills, lost time at work and at school, lowered productivity when our health allows. Chevron pollutes our city with misinformation about anyone holding them accountable, misinformation about the toxins they release, misinformation about the damage they do to animals, plants, people. Chevron pollutes our economy by refusing to pay their fair share in taxes, by putting their profit over the health of our community.
That's current city council member Eduardo Martinez, and he kind of says it best. Pretty much sums up why we're here, why we're making this podcast. And my name's Danny. I use she, they pronouns. I'm actually new to East Bay, new to Richmond from Long Beach, where we have a lot of similar issues with industry and otherwise. So super excited to be here.
And I'm Sol, la prima, la profe, I'm third generation Richmond resident, super excited to be here to talk about the work that we have been doing.
Hello. This is Alfredo. I am another organizer with the Listening Project. I am a lifelong resident of Richmond, and I use the they series of pronouns, and I'm also glad to be here.
Beautiful. So I think we just wanted to start off with what brought us here today. What is our first episode? Go over kind of lay of the land, and really get to the point of what we've been doing for the last couple of months. And so I came into this work because exactly like Council Member Martinez talked about, there is a huge impact on our communities right now with the climate crisis happening in Richmond. And in this episode, we're really going to be highlighting incredible voices that we spent time surveying, interviewing. We surveyed over 217 people in our community about the climate crisis from all walks of life, from young students, 15 years old, to 80-year-old retirees throughout every single barrio, through every single district. And I think that's what I'm super excited to really hear our collective voices.
Yeah, I'm kind of more on the nerdy side of this. I studied environmental science and environmental justice in school, and we were able to kind of use those things that I have learned in the past. And the state puts out these mapping tools where we can actually track pollution in neighborhoods, in communities, and we use those to figure out which areas were most impacted. So districts 1, 3, and 5 in Richmond are the most impacted. That's unincorporated North Richmond, Iron Triangle, Central Richmond, Pullman, just to name some of the neighborhoods there.
Yeah, and I mean, for me, I am just an angry young person who grew up next to a refinery. That is what I bring to the table. So we through the process of this work, after our surveying, we interviewed a bunch of people. And that is what this podcast is. This is us sharing, amplifying the voices of our community and putting it into our community's ears. As the climate crisis elevates, a lot of work needs to happen. And a lot of that starts with education. And so our big goal with this is to really pierce through the veil of misinformation that exists and really have our community, show our community what's going on. And so we'll start by one of the first questions that we asked in our interviews, which was, what does our community know about Chevron and Richmond? What do you know about Chevron and Richmond? Let's listen to some of our community voices. First, you'll hear from Isabella, a climate justice activist, Teresa, who works with Urban Tilth, and Randy, who is a community leader. Disclaimer, most of these interviews took place either over Zoom or outdoor somewhere. We are in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, in case you are listening to this 20 years into the future. So, okay, let's get started.
Well, Chevron is one of the top polluters here in California, and that within itself actually just says a lot, because here California is one of the biggest states here in the United States, and not only are they a big polluter with their refineries, but they're also very extractive to indigenous communities in the global south, where they get a lot of their oil. And these different points definitely connect. Just because we're not in the area of extraction doesn't mean that we shouldn't silence their struggles, because we too are dealing with the outcome of what the extraction of oil does, and that refines it and pollutes communities like us. And this is where we just all need to pay attention and be more aware, and even just take the responsibility to speak up and stand up and join together to become a stronger voice with one another.
Before we move on to Teresa, one really important thing that Isabella brought up that we need to highlight is the fact that all of these fossil fuel operations, all of our operations here as a city, the things that we do in our work takes place on unceded Ohlone land. So this problem with Chevron transcends so many different things, and the taking of indigenous land from people and use for our capitalistic needs as a country is in itself a massive problem. But let's continue to Teresa.
Richmond is one of many cities across the world that is considered a Chevron city, and Chevron owning so many more branches than just the name Chevron has a much bigger impact than any of us really realize when you look at it on where all their investments lie. Their role that they're playing is making climate change move faster and faster, and pushing down many different communities and indigenous people, not just from pumping oil, but that also means deforestation. That also means waterways being messed up and covered in algae, and it's all connected, and it goes down the line of more and more problem.
That Chevron redefines something to make gas out here. They've been out here for over 50 years. I know they flow a lot of money in the city as we're doing business here. Let us sponsor half of everything to make sure that we're on the good side. I put that in quotation marks. They try to do things behind the scenes to try to control the city of Richmond. So they're not the name in front of it. They try to use people and organizations to come out in front and not so much try to put their name on it. Trying to say they're a good neighbor, but in hindsight, they're not being a good neighbor. And all of their corporation, their first business to look at is after themselves and their bottom line and their money. And secondly is their employees. And thirdly is the community in which they stay in. So I think that their priorities are the bottom line, making sure that their employees get the bottom.
And that was Randy Joseph, a community leader here. And, he's essentially recapping what Isabella and Teresa are talking about, and the real culprit here, which is Chevron's greed. And what happens when a corporation puts profit over people and over the people's health. And so I'm really interested to see what happened. Like, how did we get to this point? What along the line in Richmond did, like Teresa say, when did we get known to be a Chevron city? And so I'm really interested to know that, and excited to get a little bit of history.
Yeah, for sure. Do you guys actually know how long Chevron has been in Richmond? Do you guys know that?
They've been here for a while.
Well, I love that Randy is like 50. I've in other interviews heard like 50, 60,
Mhm.
70 years. I've heard other people just say like all my life. And so I don't even know how we quantify like that.
Mhm.
Yeah, so I mean, I talked to Andres Soto. For anyone who does not know him, lifetime Richmond resident, very involved in the community, environmental activist, former
Shout out to the Theo.
yeah,
Yep.
former organizer with CBE. But he kind of dropped all this knowledge for me, gave me a rundown of the history. But before we get into that, I just want to say Chevron has been here for literally over 100 years. So just put that in everyone's mind as you listen to this.
The history of Chevron is there was a man named August McDonald who owned a shipping pier in South Richmond that the local farmers would bring him produce, and he had the ships that would ship them to San Francisco and Oakland produce markets. August McDonald, whom McDonald Avenue is named after, reached out to a railroad company called Atchison, Topeka, Santa Fe, and convinced them that they should make their western terminus toward the end of the line, Richmond, California. And he similarly then also, and these two are inextricably linked, lured an oil company called Pacific Oil Company to set up a refinery there in what we would now call Point Richmond. And in order to do that, they had to blast out massive amounts of rock because what we call Point Richmond was an island. And there was wetlands, a marsh in between Point Richmond and what we would now call downtown Richmond or central Richmond, like where McDonald and Barrett and all that is at. So they quarried out the rock, filled it in, built the railroad, and then built a refinery. The railroad came in 1901, the refinery in 1902. The city of Richmond was incorporated in 1907. And so it was not officially even a city until after those two entities were established. And then Richmond became one of the first places where the corporate interest in California trying to thwart a growing socialist political movement in California and the so-called progressive movement of those days, led by eventually Governor Hiram Johnson, was to change the charter of the city of Richmond, the way its government worked. Because most governments at that time, you elected a mayor and the mayor appointed who was going to run the city. And people were elected in districts representing their neighborhood, and that configured the city council. And but Chevron didn't want that kind of popular control over their city.
I just want to thank Theo Andres for just an incredible rich history of what's going on in our rich city and what really went down. I don't know if y'all noticed, there's some names that really ring a bell in there. You know, Santa Fe, Atchison, McDonald Avenue. I mean, these are all districts that and neighborhoods that we definitely know about. And just to get that history of when we drive or when we live in these neighborhoods, who they're actually founded after. And I think it does show the pervasiveness of these corporate folks coming in into a space, industry folks coming into a space and literally creating a city for their needs. And those needs, just in case y'all didn't catch that, when Theo talks, he talks about a city charter. You can think of a city charter essentially as our constitution, our city constitution. And so what happens when we have a constitution in a city that was made by industry folks? And how does that affect our history?
I think this goes back to that point that Randy literally just made earlier about like the priorities in the city, or at least in Chevron's operation, where it's like, you know, the profit comes first, and then comes their workers, and then comes the city. On a side note, I think most people who grew up in Richmond can relate to this. There is a McDonald's on McDonald's. I thought for most of my life that McDonald's Avenue was named after that McDonald's, which is not true.
That's hella funny.
Like Andres said, apparently that's the dude that brought the Santa Fe Railroad here. And you know, that comes to this bigger point that like when we talk about the development of Richmond as a city, like we can't overstate the importance of Black Americans in making Richmond what it is today, but also of industry and bringing people here. Our population grew like massively as a result of the Great Migration. For those of you that listening that might not know, the Great Migration was a period in history of a mass migration of African Americans from the South to the West Coast to escape things like the Jim Crow South, but also for job opportunities, which here in Richmond were endless. And that's part of this like deep industrial history that we don't really talk about, like the Santa Fe neighborhood, like you just said, was from the Santa Fe Railroad line. You know, the Pullman Car Company used to make their cars out of here. Pullman Village, which is now public housing, was housing for their workers. What else?
Think about the Richmond High School Oilers. Oilers, a can from the oil.
That is our mascot, is a dude in an oil can.
That's it. While other folks get bears and lions and tigers and everything else, we get our a guy with a can.
Yeah, I went to high school in Oakland, and we had a sick ass panther. So it was tight.
Amazing.
Okay, so now let's listen to Andres talk a little bit more about Richmond past the 40s and 50s and deeper into the 60s and 70s and where we are today.
One of the things that happened in the 60s was also African Americans then started demanding the civil rights movement a fair share in Richmond. And this led to a lot of conflict, a lot of police violence against the African American community, the rise of the Black Panther movement. And the Chicanos also had the Brown Berets, a very active chapter here in Richmond. And so that was all part of the social change, you know, the anti-war movement in Berkeley that impacted, you know, a lot of people, especially the Euro-American population was still here. The young people were actively involved in the anti-war movement. So all these things came together, and this was also the time the environmental movement started to emerge, and Earth Day was first created and things like this. So in Richmond, because of the consciousness of some of the people in the African American community, we started to see like people like Fred Jackson, people like Ethel Dotson, Whitney Dotson, and their father, Reverend Dotson, and people like Henry Clark. We started to see people articulating the nexus between racism, housing discrimination and redlining, and environmental impacts, negative environmental impacts. And that is now the movement called environmental justice. And so Richmond was on the ground floor of the development of that movement back in the 60s and the 70s. And it really began to flourish in the 1980s. And that's when Communities for a Better Environment came to Richmond. I'm one of a number of people who have been the organizers in Richmond for CBE. And so I think what really began to change was a consciousness that Chevron was not just this big benevolent company, but it was a significant contributor to negative health outcomes and how that works on the community with the extraordinarily high rates of asthma, cancer, psoriasis. All these things are autoimmune diseases. So our breathing in of the toxic particulate matter, which is the fallout from refinery processes, is so small it penetrates our lung tissues and goes directly into our blood and disrupts our autoimmune systems. And so, for example, in my family, I had a brother who got cancer when he was 18 months old on his brain and ended up dying a month before his third birthday. That's when I was 7 years old.
Wow, that story is really impactful to me because as a young child, I had a young brother, a baby brother, going through breathing treatments and in and out of the hospital, fighting to breathe with asthma. And I can't imagine if he was no longer in my life. I can't imagine being a young child losing a baby brother. And that's the reality of so many families. And my condolences, obviously, to the entire Soto family for that tragic loss. And these are the real repercussions that our families in Richmond and our residents are going through, and we have to live with. And I also can't imagine what it is like for the workers, and just thoughts out and going out to bringing them into the space as well.
Yeah, that's a really good point. A lot of the time, workers' rights and the long-term health effects of Chevron workers aren't talked about. But in 1989, I actually did some research, and there was a fire that broke out that year. And after the fire had been taken care of, a lot of the employees actually had been injured. So naturally, some of the safety organizations, workers' rights organizations, kind of examined what happened here. And there was a lot of hazards at the refinery that Chevron knew about, things that were avoidable. Basically, the fire should not have broken out. There's all these mandates that they were ignoring that led to that fire. But kind of make it worse, they sent 109 employees to fight that fire on site. And those employees were not given protective equipment, were not given the proper, yeah, I mean, think about it. Can you imagine going to fight a fire in jeans and like a cotton shirt? No.
Right. Jesus, I literally cannot imagine. And I'm sure that this isn't the only incident. I'm sure that there are so many more incidences. And I am just thinking like, wait a minute, I was 2 years old and I never knew that that even happened. And I was 2 years old, not to get my age out there, please, nobody judge me. But that's like, how many other families didn't know what was going on? Or young people that are my age didn't know that that was also going on.
Yeah, it's actually that was the biggest workers' rights lawsuit, and Chevron had to pay a huge fine, the biggest one ever paid because of these known hazards in the 80s. So yeah,
And that's really like a trend that hasn't changed, and is a trend that like we always see that with, especially with these refinery fires, is that a lot of these things could have been avoided. Like you said, like the 89 fire could have been avoided, and the 2012 fire, the big fire that we all have fresh in our minds, that was from a leaky diesel pipe that the refinery knew they needed to change, but they neglected maintaining that, and a bunch of other things that went wrong that led to that 2012 explosion.
I remember that bringing up our alert system that so many people know, and doing a little bit of research, that leaky pipe was actually discovered around 4:30, and then it took Chevron another 2 hours to even bring in and alert the county about what was going on. And if you're from our community, you hear our monthly Wednesday alarm going off to know that there is an alert system, a warning system to shelter in place. And so how is it that it took two fucking hours to alert our community members to shelter in place, to go home? And I think it really talks about, and we'll hear obviously in future episodes, people talk about just that day in our overall history of being in Richmond, around how we take care of each other, how young people were outside smelling stuff, alerting teachers, how teachers were alerting parents, how parents were alerting grandparents, grandparents were grabbing their kids and bringing them inside without even knowing, but just with the smell, knowing that we have to protect ourselves. And it really shows just how we truly take care of each other in Richmond.
Yeah, I think that the panic that we see now, like anytime that anything happens in Chevron, it like really shows one, how traumatic that was for everybody, but also how resilient the community is in terms of like watching out for each other. Anytime that anything happens at Chevron, we see all over social media, we see people outside telling people to go inside and don't let your kids out.
And I think you bring up the 2012 fire. Most recently in 2021, there was a huge oil spill, crude oil of about 5 gallons a minute. 5 gallons a minute. Okay. And that was a total of around 600 gallons of crude oil in our bay. And I remember biking in that area. I'm an avid bike rider, so shout out to my bike, Little Red, riding the hood, but AKA Little Red. And we were riding, and all of a sudden, I'm like smelling something, and because I always go to the Bay Trail in Point Richmond, and I'm like, oh my God, it's such a beautiful area to explore, to ride, and yet all of a sudden, you have this smell. And then in days afterwards, I see all of these signs that are saying hazardous, stay off the trails. And those are the impacts. And so I went on my social media and was like alerting people of like, stay out of this area. And yet that was in 2021 and we're in 2022 now. And they have yet to take any type of responsibility. They are still haven't fully brought it to city council.
It's almost been an entire year and they haven't spoken to city council about it.
These are the larger issues, and it really does, it points to how we are our alert system, we are our rapid responders, we truly respond in ways that Chevron will never respond to. And it goes to what Randy said, because that's not their bottom line. Their bottom line is to make sure that their operations continue. And so I would, I just want to uplift that narrative around us and how critical we are to our own community.
So we've talked today about the history of Chevron in our city and how we got to the point that we are today. As we close off this episode, we'd like to leave you with this last question to think about. What does this mean for the health of our community? What are the repercussions of living with California's second largest polluter right in our backyard?
Absolutely. Those are such good questions. And we know you've been on a roller coaster. You've been on this journey with us. And so we want to thank you for tuning in and tuning into our next week's episode. And as we know that this can be really heavy, we wanted to send a message, a hopeful message from our community to our community. And this will be a segment that we end every single episode on. And so it's called Listen Up. So we will see you all next week. Here is Saeed. So listen up.
To the city of Richmond and to all my everybody I love and care about, the whole city. I love you. I want y'all to be great. Always remember that, Richmond is one place. It's a very big world out there. But also, once you do go explore the world, come back to your city and, sow these seeds and plant these seeds and watch these flowers and these trees grow and blossom into, and into something big, and watch our dreams and our goals and aspirations come into fruition. So, man, I love you, Richmond, pride and purpose, and salute, man. Stay up.
And I know I ain't the hottest, but I promise Rich City, I got us. Believe me, I got you. You got me, I got you. You got me, I got you. Hey, Rich City, I'll never let you go. You don't know that I love you, Rich. You don't know that I love you, Rich. Rich City, baby.
Thanks for tuning in to the Listening Project podcast. A special thanks to the Richmond Progressive Alliance for making this podcast possible. The RPA's goal is to take power back from corporations and put it into the hands of the people. To learn more, visit their website at richmondprogressivealliance.net. Thanks so much.